Hi, I'm Dan Deppen, and today I'm going to share with you how partials work in note investing and how you can use them to retire early. But first, I want to let you know if you're interested in note investing, if you want to learn how you can get involved, you can go and download my 5 free steps for getting started in note investing. You'll find a link to where you can get that in the description below, either in the podcast or in the video. That'll also get you on my email list where you'll receive regular tips and tricks and information on note investing. But now getting into what a note investing partial is. So all a partial is on a note is when you go out and you buy a mortgage note and then you sell a portion of the future payments that you're going to receive. So you're not selling the entire note. You're basically selling a piece of your note and refinancing yourself back out and holding on to the back end of the payments. And there are a lot of reasons why this is really powerful that I'm going to get into. So let's take an example. Let's start the most basic example. Forget partials for a second. Let's say we go out and we're just going to buy a solid performing mortgage note. Now, in the example I have for you here is a real note that I looked at recently in Houston, Texas. And say this loan has a loan balance of about $127,800. We're able to buy it at a pretty healthy discount, $99,500. And this loan makes monthly payments of $1,250, and there's 195 payments remaining. Don't worry about memorizing all of these numbers if you're not watching the video version of this. I'll take you through the main points. So when we go out, we buy this performing mortgage note, we're entitled to receive the remaining payments, right? So there are 195 payments left on this loan. We buy the loan, then in theory, we'll receive these 195 payments over the next 195 months. And obviously the borrower could pay off early, right? It's rare that it actually works like that. But for the sake of analyzing our returns, that's how we look at it. So we bought this loan for $99,500. And we're going to have some due diligence expenses with that. So we're going to, order some photos or broker price opinion. We're going to get an O&E report, submit a title report. If we're smart, we're going to have an attorney review the documentation to make sure we're not missing something. And let's say that costs $500. So we're all in on this note for about $100,000 precisely. Now we're going to be by the note, we're going to begin getting our $12,050 monthly payments, right? But we don't get to keep that whole thing because we're going to hire a loan servicer to service this loan for us. And let's say we're spending $35 a month on that loan servicing, which is pretty typical. So we're going to actually net. So instead of 195 payments of $1,250, we're going to net 195 payments of $1,215. But when you do that math, or 100,000 in upfront costs, or 195 monthly payments of $1,215, that's going to work out to a 12.68% ROI. And that's factoring in our expenses. So that's pretty solid, right? And it's a pretty good deal, especially on a note like this one that has a good pay history. Borrower's got a lot of equity. It's unlikely the loan's going to stop performing. You're going to have to foreclose. And even if you do, this particular one is in Texas, which is probably the easiest state to do that in. So pretty solid, over 12.5% return. So this is the kind of thing I like to buy in my self-directed IRA and just hold on to. So just buying the note is a pretty good deal in and of itself, but there are things we can do to make this better. So what if instead of buying this note and holding on to it, I choose to go out and sell a partial instead? Now, when I sell the partial, so the first half of this transaction, I go out and I buy the note, just like I described, right? I'm all in for $100,000 on this cost of the note plus expenses. I'm going to get my $1,215 net payments for 195 months. Now what I do instead of holding it is I go out and I find an investor who's happy with an 8% return. And this investor maybe either doesn't want to or isn't equipped to go out and find this deal for themselves. So you're going to go bring this deal to the investor and say, hey, Mr. Investor, for $100,000 refinancing myself out, I will sell you 120 of the 195 payments for that net $1,215. And that's going to work out to an 8% return for the investor. So now what I've done, I bought the note, I sold the partial at the same price. So I've refinanced myself out. I have no money in the deal at this point. Now, you don't have to structure them this way, right? You don't have to take all your money out. You could still sell a portion. I mean, in theory, if you can pull it off, you may even sell the partial for more than what you sold the note for. But in this example, I'm selling the partial for what I spent on the note. So now I've got no money in the deal, which is kind of nice. So, how does this look after that? Well, the investor who bought the partial from you, they're going to, for the next 120 months, they're going to receive their net payments of $1,215. And I'm going to receive zero, right? Which might seem odd. So you might say, well, wait a minute, from not receiving anything, how is that better than holding the note? And the key thing to remember here is that I've refinanced myself out of the deal. So I'm not receiving payments for 120 months, but I don't have any money in this deal. Now, what's really cool is once you hit month 120, so 10 years from now, pretty far in the future, now I'm going to begin receiving payments 121 through 195. So there's going to be 75 months where I collect $1,215. And that's going to total about $91,125 to me. And I've had no money in the deal at all right now. So if I'm trying to calculate my return, it's essentially infinite at this point, which is pretty sweet. So, if I look at the reality, right, there's a little bit of timing involved. So I spent 100,000 on this deal and then I sold the partial. You could, in theory, do like a double close and sell it right away. In practice, that's probably not going to happen. So you're going to have money in the deal for, maybe a month or two, right? But then you're cashed out and you effectively have nothing in it. And then we get all that money on the back end. So my returns are good enough, right? Like I'm kind of rolling in cash here. And I've also, because I don't have any money in the deal, I've also taken all my risk out as well, which is kind of cool. But there's actually, it actually gets a little better than that. Most of the time, the borrower isn't just going to make those 195 payments, right, over the next 15 or 16 years or whatever it is. More than likely, at some point along the way, the borrower is going to pay off the loan early. They're just going to pay it off early themselves, or they're going to refinance it or do something. And when that borrower makes an early payoff, all of the 195 payments get paid. So more than likely, I'm not going to be waiting 10 years to get my money. So if we look at the total profits that are going to get distributed between myself and the partial buyer, if they pay off that loan tomorrow, they're paying off the 127,800 balance. And we put $100,000 into this, right? So there's essentially 27,000 in profit that gets divvied between the partial investor and me, depending on how many payments I sold off. And that's great as well. Now, the next question is like, what's everyone's incentives, right? Like, why would both parties engage in this? So for me, as the person who's buying the note and selling the partial, one, I'm refinancing myself out of the deal, right? So because I don't have to leave money in this deal, I can do theoretically an infinite number of these. So if I've built my note investing system, I know where to find these things. I know how to do due diligence. I know how to price them. I know how to close them. I can do this again and again and again and again. I'm only limited by my time to do the transactions and the number of deals that I can find, and then the number of partial buyers that I can find in my network. So that's pretty cool. Now, the other thing I can do, and this is where I think these are really powerful, is I can do this within my self-directed IRA retirement account. So one of the big pushbacks people have, or one of the things that makes people wince at this idea, is the thought that they're not going to receive any payments for 10 years. But if you're doing this in a retirement account, like let's say you're age 48, like I am right now, well, I'm not touching my retirement savings until I'm in my 60s either way. So if money doesn't start flowing into my retirement account for 10 years, why do I care? I'm not touching it anyhow. In fact, I've been putting money in various retirement accounts since I was about 22, right? Like some of that money, by the time I get to it, will have been locked up for over 40 years. So in the grand scheme of retirement, 10 years sounds like a lot. In reality, I don't think it really is. Now, the other thing that you can do, and this is something that I'll be doing more of later this year, is building these deferred cash flows, whether you're setting them up, and you can architect these a lot of different ways, right? So whether I'm setting up these partials so that my cash flows show up in 8 years or 10 years, 12 years, or whatever, the other thing I can do is put together an early retirement plan. So let's say I'm doing this maybe outside of a retirement account. So I'm age 48. Let's say I go out this year and I do a bunch of these that are going to start cash flowing in 10 years when I'm 58. Well, I'm not really limited in the number of these I can do. And each one of these, at least like this example, it's netting a $1,215 monthly payment. So if I go out and do a bunch of these, I'm going to have some pretty nice cash flows when I'm 58 years old. And I could use that to retire early. So maybe I stop working at age 58 instead of, somewhere in my 60s or 70s or wherever. Now, in reality, me being me and the way I'm geared, I doubt I'll ever completely stop working. Like I got to be doing something, right? Either way. But that's something you can do to potentially quit your job early. One of the things everybody wants to know is like, how do I quit my job with notes right now? And, having done it, it's challenging. It's a lot of work. It takes a lot of time. But if you're willing to say, hey, what can I do to quit my job in like 8 years, 10 years? It starts to become actually pretty straightforward. I hesitate to call it easy because it's work, but compared to doing it now, like and compared to other options, I consider it kind of easy. The other reason I sell the partials is, I get these potentials for early payoff, so I may get little windfalls beforehand. Now let's look at this a little bit from the buyer's perspective. Like as the buyer, why would I go out and buy a partial at, like 8% in my example? Sometimes people do these at 10%, whatever, rather than just go out and buy the note myself and make that 12.6% return that I talked about early. Well, number one, I'm getting a pretty steady return with the partial, considering the note's well underwritten. It's a solid performing note. So if I'm making this 8 to 10% return, it's actually a little bit higher than the long-term stock market average. It definitely tends to be better than bonds and treasuries, and it comes with less volatility than the stock market. So let's say I am, deep into my 50s or I'm in my 60s and retirement's coming up, and I don't want to be exposed to a stock market shock where it could drop 30% in the blink of an eye, which in my stock investing career, I think I've seen 3 times now, in the dot-com crash, the financial crisis, and then COVID, right? So you can earn those higher returns and you can reduce some of the volatility, which is nice. The other thing is learning to buy notes takes a little bit of work, right? There aren't that many note investors out there. There aren't that many people who know how to take advantage of this space. So from the perspective of the partial buyer, it's relatively passive. There's a lot less effort than going out, sourcing this myself and negotiating with the seller, closing the deal, blah, blah, blah. I'm letting someone else who's more experienced do that sourcing and due diligence for me. Now, as the partial buyer, you should still be doing some due diligence yourself. You want to make sure that that note is well underwritten and someone's not, selling you partial, on a crap loan or something like that. But it is a lot less effort than doing everything yourself. And the other reason you might buy a partial, it's a really nice entry point into note investing. So if you're interested in note investing and you're like, hey, I want to get started, but I'm a little nervous, there's a lot going on here. Partials are a little bit lighter way to get involved in a deal where you don't have to quite do as much, right? So maybe you buy a partial just with the intent of learning how some of this works and then taking it further and buying notes on your own after that. And then the last reason you buy a partial is it's just really good for retirement accounts, right? If you're looking for steady income in there, like I said, especially as you're getting close to retirement, these things can be pretty nice. So the good thing about partials, if you look at all the parties involved, their incentives are pretty well aligned. There's not really one part or the other that's like getting one over on the other or anything like that. So if we want to do this, right, like how do we actually set this up? And number one, you're going to need a partial agreement that both you and the buyer sign. You're going to want to have an attorney write that up. Now, there are a million permutations of how you can set these up. One of the things you're going to want to define is who's retaining the servicing. So there are ways to set these up where the partial seller handles the servicing and then sends the partial payments to the buyer. That's one way to do it. The way that I prefer is to use a loan servicer that can manage this for you. FCI loan servicing is particularly good at this. They have some special programs for doing it. We can board this loan with FCI. You give them the partial agreement. You say, here's how everything works. And then what they do is the partial buyer has the servicing, FCI sends the borrower payments directly to them. And then they switch it when the time comes, when the partial agreement expires. And it's a pretty nice way to have a third party manage this transaction for you. That's my preferred way to do it. One of the big questions that people always have in this is, okay, that's wonderful. This is assuming the borrower is making all these payments, but what happens if they stop performing? Well, number one, this is one of the things that needs to be specified in the agreement, but I'll give you some options for how you can set this up. One way to do it, and this is my preference, is that whoever bought the note and sold the partial is responsible for the workout. I think this is a good thing because then the partial seller is actually still retaining some skin in the game. Like I mentioned earlier, okay, it's great for me as the partial seller because I've refinanced myself out of kind of eliminated a lot of my risk. But I think having the seller be on the hook to do the workout if the loan stops performing provides the incentive to make sure that that note that they're buying and selling the partial on is well underwritten and going to tend to be a solid performing note. Plus, your partial buyers tend to be the people who are a little less immersed in this world, right? And they may not be equipped to deal with the workout. So for me as the seller, especially for me as a very active note investor who's done a lot of foreclosures and workouts of non-performing notes, if that note stops performing, I kind of want my hands on the wheel anyways, because I know I'm probably going to be able to do a better job than the person I sold the partial to of getting this worked out. And then I bear the cost of that. That's just part of the way that I set it up. So some things to look for, right? So when we're sourcing notes, let's say, okay, Dan, this is a cool play. I want to go out and try this. Like, what kind of notes are good fits for selling partials? Well, number one thing we're looking for is low risk, right? Now I know that goes at odds with, the pricing that you can get, but what we really want, if we're going to sell a partial, we want to give ourselves the highest probability of this note just continuing to perform, even though we're going to have hooks in our agreement and we're going to have plans in case this stops performing. I really don't want to go there, right? So one of the ways you identify low risk is just looking at the loan to value. Fortunately, a lot of the loans that are out there now, if they were generated a few years ago, property values have gone up for the most part. Borrowers tend to have a lot of equity. So that provides the borrower an incentive to keep paying. The other thing to look at is seasoning, right? So how much has the borrower demonstrated their ability to pay? If the borrower has been in the property for 5, 10 years, they're probably not going to let it go. And a foreclosure, if you're looking at a newly originated note or like a newly originated seller finance note, you're not going to have that seasoning. It doesn't mean you can't sell a partial on it. It just means there's some other things in the underwriting you're going to have to look at to make sure that the risk level is appropriate. So was it originated with an RMLO? What's the borrower's credit score? How much of a down payment did they make? How much skin do they have in the game? What do the comps look like in that area? What's the borrower credit? If it was done with an RMLO, that implies it's Dodd-Frank compliant, which is very important as well. So those are some of the things we look at when we're trying to identify loans that are good candidates for partials. You would never, ever, ever sell a partial on a non-performing loan. I know that's obvious, but I'll just state it anyways. Now, okay, so that's some of the things we're looking for when we're buying loans. What about finding the partial buyers, like the investors who are going to buy these things from us? And number one, the best way to do it is through your network. So hopefully you have an email list of other real estate investors, friends, people you know who are interested in this type of thing or who may have self-directed IRA accounts. There are a number of note investing and other real estate investing Facebook groups, LinkedIn groups, where you can often make posts on there and say, hey, I've got this partial to sell. And you can always find buyers in those places. The other thing you can do if it's available in your area are local real estate meetups, right? Even if they're not necessarily note specific, generally investors have cash that they're looking to deploy. So local meetups are really nice too, because then you can also meet the people face to face. Or if you want to get out and about a little bit, you can attend note conferences. So if you go to something like Note Expo, it takes place in the fall. There are a handful of other conferences related to either note investing or self-directed IRAs, like the Quest Expo. You'll find a lot of people with cash in either retirement accounts or after-tax accounts that they need to put to work. So a few more comments on, the power of creating these deferred income streams. What we're basically doing here at the end of the day is we're generating passive income. Passive income that's going to show up some number of years in the future. Now, in reality, nothing is actually passive, right? When I go out and I find a note and I do due diligence and I buy it and I find the partial buyer and I sell the partial and I set up the servicing and yada, 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 that's not passive. That takes time to do. But what we can actually do is shift when we do the work, right? So I can go out in 2024, I can do a bunch of work generating a lot of these. And then say 10 years from now, when I'm 58, these cash flows are just going to show up. So when I want to receive the cash flows, it's passive at that point, right? And these are really powerful. So, comparing these to like a W-2 salary. Okay, if I work a W-2 salary today, I get paid essentially today. In reality, maybe a couple weeks later or something like that. But with these, when you're generating future cash flows and like with partials, they have much higher leverage, right? So I'm doing a deal now, I'm getting paid later. And but if you look at my overall return, it's much higher, right? So in my example, I had $90,000 in returns with no money invested in the deal. You know, maybe I spent X number of hours putting it together. So my hourly rate is pretty high. And I know people will say, yeah, but Dan, inflation is whatever percent. So that's worth less in 10 years or 15 years. And that's true. But the math still works where your hourly rate, even when you do the present value calculation to put it in today's dollars versus what you're going to get in the future, your hourly rate is going to be way, way higher than any W-2 that you can do. So if your time preference is sooner, right? Like I want to get paid now, it's going to be a much lower leverage endeavor. If I'm willing to wait, even 10 years, I can get extraordinarily high leverage in that. And that's really the power of these things. So like, let's look at some quick math, and I'll try to keep it simple for the people who are in listening mode. So looking at our example with $1,215 in monthly cash flows that start in 10 years, what really stops me from going out and doing 10 of them this year? If I go out and do 10, I've created 12,000 in monthly cash flows in 10 years. And so for me at age 48, let's say I do this over the course of 2024, and then at age 58 in 10 years, I decide to retire. And now I'm getting this extra 12K a month that shows up when I retire. That's an extra 144K a year. And let's say that's not enough. I need more. Well, I can go out and I can do more. There's nothing really stopping me from doing that. Or you say, okay, 144K is not enough to retire on. That's fine, because eventually you're going to be collecting Social Security. Hopefully your entire retirement plan does not consist of doing a bunch of partials in 2024. Hopefully you've got other assets there that you've saved that you'll eventually be tapping into that you can do beyond that. You may also have other income sources. So this is like icing on the cake, right? And so this is something you can do to shift your retirement date closer or make your retirement more cushy, right? It's really up to you. So looking at like some hourly rate type stuff, when I mentioned these things where we have the longer time preference, when I'm willing to wait, they're higher leverage. Well, let's say I spent 20 hours on this deal, and that 20 hours consists of finding the deal, going through the due diligence, getting the deal closed, finding the partial buyer, working with an attorney to get the agreement set up, all of that stuff, right? And then I get 75 payments of 1215, which is a total of 91,000. Well, if I spent 21 hours or 20 hours and I get 91,000, that's like over $4,500 per hour. And yeah, even if you discount that, assuming 3 or 4% inflation over the next 10 to 15 years or whatever, it's still a hell of a lot, right? And so I mentioned, going out and doing 10 of these and making 12K a month. Let's say you're making 10K a month, and let's say you have 120K W2 a year W2 job. That equates to like $60 an hour, right? So you can make way, way, way more doing this. It's way more than 10x. It's over 50x doing that. So this can be a really efficient use of your time. And again, the rub is that you got to wait to get the payments. But if you're willing to wait and defer a little bit, this can be super powerful. So that's what I've got for you today on partials. I encourage you to kind of let that sink in and think about not just partials, but other kinds of investment vehicles where you can do some work now and get paid later, because they tend to be very, very high leverage. And again, if you want to start heading further down the note rabbit hole, you can download my 5 free steps for getting started in note investing, and you can find that link in the description. And I will see you next time. Thanks.